Welcome to 20th Century Philosophy. To begin our discussion of W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, I wanted to put the text into some historical context. The publication date for our text is 1903, the very beginning of the 20th century, and this was a time of enormous tumult in the United States, particularly around race. In 1865, the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was passed prohibiting slavery. So that was the most important tumultuous event. And shortly afterwards, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, granting equal protection of the law and overruling the 1857 Dred Scott decision. And in that decision, the Supreme Court argued that no one of African descent is a U.S. citizen, and so no one has the right to sue in court. Dred Scott was suing to be liberated. He had traveled to a free state, and there was a law that if a slave traveled to a free state, then that slave could no longer be taken back to a slave state and should be freed. And so Dred Scott sued in order to be able to be free, but it was ruled that he had no standing because he was not a citizen. So the 14th Amendment granted citizenship, but it wasn't until 2 years later, in 1870, that the 15th Amendment passed, prohibiting discrimination in voting rights. So it wasn't until the 15th Amendment that black men were given the right to vote. Women were still not given the right to vote at this point. But in 1870, men were given the right to vote, and this was an important, all three of these amendments were very important and significant changes to racial relations within the United States, giving important rights and freedoms to black people altogether and to black men in particular in terms of voting rights. But it's in response to these events then we start to see pushback from white people, particularly Southern whites, towards the newly freed status of formerly enslaved people. And so the revolution in 1876 is referred to by Du Bois in a couple of places, and this was in relation to the presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and that was disputed by Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And Southern Democrats in general in the Congress were threatening to secede from the Union. So here it is, only 10 years after the Civil War was supposed to have settled this very bloody war in the United States. There's still enormous tension between the South and the North, and Northern Democrats mollified their Southern counterparts and pushed back or pulled back on freeing the slaves and their support for the freed slaves in terms of instituting the kinds of freedoms and equality that would be expected under, for example, the 15th Amendment prohibiting discrimination. So in 1876 also you have Jim Crow laws being passed, and that's an example of the ways in which Southern Democrats in particular were trying to undermine the amendments that were passed to try to reinstate segregation by race. So you had the poll tax where you had to pay a certain amount of money in order to be able to vote, and newly freed slaves didn't have any money to be able to do that. Literacy tests, and again, education was not something that many black people had at that point. So these kinds of standards were instituted, these kinds of laws were instituted to restrict voting rights on the part of black people. And this lasted until the 1965 Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act banned any kind of voter discriminations, poll taxes, literacy tests, those kinds of things, and instituted oversight on the most egregious states in terms of their inequality between black and white voters. Very recently, that those provisions were overturned by the Supreme Court, and we see a reinstituting again of exactly those sorts of provisions. Voter ID arguably functions in a discriminatory way. There are kinds of restrictions on people who are leaving prison that are, require them to pay all of their prison fees before they're allowed to vote. So restrictions like this function similarly to the poll tax and the literacy test in order to continue to repress the vote of people of color in the United States. In 1886, Plessy versus Ferguson was another important Supreme Court decision that separate but equal was okay, and this was a case where a black person was objecting to the division of train cars into black cars and white cars, and saying that this was a form of discrimination. And the Supreme Court at that time in Plessy versus Ferguson said, yeah, or said, no, that's not discrimination, that's fine. And that, of course, was overruled in 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, looking specifically at the Kansas school district, and they showed that separate is inherently unequal, that anytime you discriminate between certain areas or certain school systems that are for people of color and other areas that are for white people, that the treatment of those different groups is inherently going to be unequal. In contrast, or in comparison with the different changes and liberation of people of color, it's important to also look and compare with the liberation of women during this time. So in 1848, there was the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. That was mostly white women. And then in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. So many years later, 50 years later, after black men were given the right to vote, women were given the right to vote, white women and black women were given the right to vote, and we'll talk a little bit later on the way in which the situation for black women is particularly difficult due to these sort of separate tracks in terms of liberation and separate issues that are motivating racial equality and gender equality, sexual equality, and the way in which black women are faced with both of those forms of discrimination is particularly problematic. And so we'll look at that later when we look at Chapter 4, The Meaning of Progress.